Somewhere deep within the decorative halls of a dimly lit palace, in a city of eternal night where a god of death is worshipped and war wages over a single crystal, a young prince adorned in black sits in slumber, awaiting the day in which he will awake to embark on his journey. However, the prince will never wake up, at least, not in the original world he was destined for. Final Fantasy Versus XIII is a game that has been all but drowned out by its own speculation. A mysterious game that was announced alongside its sister title, Final Fantasy XIII, the project underwent many changes until it transformed into something distant. The parts are there, and you can sense the familiarity, but it's become so far away that you'll never get close enough to grasp anything tangible. The game is almost a myth, a figment of our collective imagination that simply whisked away into a thin veil, only loosely resembling what we were promised. Yet, for something that never truly existed, its legacy is real, and its influence so visceral that its own creator refuses to let the world forget its memory. This is the legacy of Final Fantasy Versus XIII.
Latin for New Tale of the Crystals, the 13th installment in the world-renowned series aims to paint a montage of compelling stories, all bound by a single underlying mythos. Development is currently underway for multiple games spanning numerous consoles such as the PlayStation 3 and mobile phones. The evolution of Final Fantasy has continued alongside the evolution of gaming itself. And as long as there are those who seek the light of the crystals, the epic will continue on into the future.
In May of 2006, Square Enix attended that year's Electronic Entertainment Expo, henceforth known as E3, to unveil their next ambitious project. A project that had been kept secret since the days of Final Fantasy X-2's development, the Fabula Nova Crystallis. This project aimed to create a series of games under its umbrella that would span different gameplay styles and narratives while all sharing a central mythos. This mythos, a tale of deities interfering with the lives of man, and the prosperity and destruction brought by a crystal, would be the narrative core that would tether these seemingly different games together. Each team that would be involved in the project would be allowed to interpret the mythos in their own way. Crisis Core director Hajime Tabata stating, "The original idea was to create a series of games around the Crystal Legend mythology, but not restrict developers to a single direction. We wanted it to be quite a broad idea. It was like the mythology of ancient Greece and how so much fiction comes out of those. It would be easier to make future Final Fantasy games if we were to create a shared mythology and base games on that." The original plan for this project consisted of 3 games. Directed by Final Fantasy X's Motomu Toriyama, Final Fantasy XIII would be the project's flagship title, which would pave the way for this ambitious project. Crisis Core's Hajime Tabata would take charge of the mobile title, Final Fantasy Agito XIII. This would later become Final Fantasy Type 0 for the PlayStation Portable in order to distance itself from the mythos. Finally, Kingdom Hearts director and character designer Tetsuya Nomura was assigned to Final Fantasy Versus XIII, a dark approach to the mythos in a modern Earth-like setting. The platform of choice was to be the PlayStation 2 following the release of Final Fantasy XII, however, these plans would quickly change. After the positive reaction to the Final Fantasy VII technical demo in 2005's E3, it was decided that both FF13 and Versus XIII were to be developed exclusively for the PlayStation 3. In order to take full advantage of the hardware at hand, Square Enix would simultaneously develop a new tool, one with enough capability to bring the titular franchise into the next generation of hardware. codenamed at the time as the White Engine, it was to be the proprietary game engine that would allocate graphical assets into one single data format. This tool would later be known as Crystal Tools, and while it allowed for ease of use in some areas for the company, it was also the source for many of Square's troubles. With a plan in place and the right tools at their disposal, the company could begin work on the new story for the crystals. Development for the project began almost immediately in 2006, the same year that the world was given their first look into the Versus epic. As revealed 2 years later, the boy we see engaging with soldiers is a prince named Noctis Lucis Caelum, the assumed protagonist of our story. The trailer opens with a view of the crowned city. An excerpt from Shakespeare's Hamlet appears on screen. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Sitting upon a throne, we see Noctis in deep thought. He soon wakes to investigate something beyond his chambers. His apathetic demeanor becomes juxtaposed with soldiers firing on all sides of him, brandishing crystalline weapons before the trailer cuts to black. Leading the team responsible for Kingdom Hearts 2 and Advent Children, Nomura set out to create something unprecedented in the franchise's history. The visuals and tone for the game were to be much darker than what Final Fantasy fans at the time were used to seeing. Rather than the high fantasy and sci-fi settings fans had come to know from the series, Versus 13 would be set in a world closer to our own, with its own fictitious crown city being inspired by the real-world Tokyo. Nomura went on to state after the game's unveiling that if Final Fantasy XIII was the light, then Versus 13 would certainly be its shadow, clarifying that the moniker Versus was a way to emphasize the game being a dark side to its sister title, and by proxy, the franchise itself. The following year, Nomura would clarify that the darkness of Versus 13 would be used as a vehicle to elaborate more on the world and human side of characters, their way of thinking, and why they behave the way that they do. While Final Fantasy in the past would cover topics of human emotion and psychology in a broad way, Nomura wanted to dive deeper in terms of offering a harsher reality of the inner workings of human behavior, a fantasy based in reality. Due to this focus is why the game would appear much more akin to the real world, but the goal would not be to become an antithesis of Final Fantasy, but rather a different take on what the series could be. Tone wouldn't be the only thing to break away from the formula, but the gameplay as well. For those that don't know, Nomura's long-running series is known as Kingdom Hearts, an action role-playing game that conjoins the worlds of Disney with Final Fantasy. While Kingdom Hearts would be a game inspired by Final Fantasy, Versus 13 would swap the formula, taking gameplay elements first established in Kingdom Hearts. An active, real-time battle system would allow players to actively engage with both their party and enemies. From the concepts that were shown in trailers past, the active party member count would be 3, and in Final Fantasy fashion, would allow the player to swap seamlessly amongst party members to play to their strengths. The HUD for the game also follows suit with Kingdom Hearts, showing a side menu for actions such as magic, item, and summon. Due to narrative reasons, Noctis was the only party member that could use magic. This means that if he wasn't within the party, they wouldn't have access to any magical abilities. And with the PlayStation 3's more powerful hardware, Nomura wanted to create larger, more seamless environments, allowing battles to be carried out through great distances or in and out of buildings without pause. In theory, this would allow players to fully immerse themselves in the world without being pulled out by loading screens when in the middle of heated moments. Combat itself was also rumored to have similar depth and complexity to Kingdom Hearts 2, but with a faster, more intense pace, giving even more freedom to players in how they choose to fight their battles. If such was the case, this would be no surprise considering the team behind the project. Over the next 4 years, sparse information for Versus 13 will be known to the public. Most marketing and attention from 2006 to 2009 would be dedicated to the company's flagship title, Final Fantasy XIII. That being said, this would not mean that Versus 13 would be entirely absent. A year and a half after the initial trailer was shown, Square Enix would unveil an extended version of the same cinematic. This time, Noctis would be shown in action, teleporting from place to place and slaying all enemies before him, only to return to his throne to rest. Through this trailer, the world saw that Nomura would not be holding back, putting the game's dark and violent approach front and center. Noctis would hide away from the world again until August of 2008. At that time, Square Enix held a fan event in which they debuted a new trailer introducing other characters we would meet along the way. Noctis' companions are finally shown: Prompto, Gladiolus, and Ignis, their relationship immediately evident as they're seen bantering amongst each other. A figure in a white robe holds a standoff with Noctis. Older men are seen speaking within a conference room, with Noctis' father and king at the head of the table. Finally, we see Noctis ready himself to battle a mysterious woman who brandishes a sword and sigil before cutting to black. The following October at the Tokyo Game Show would be when Noctis' name would finally be revealed to the public. Furthermore, the mysterious woman we saw 2 months earlier would also be named Stella. 1 year later, in 2009, Versus 13 would make a brief appearance at the Tokyo Game Show, but little else would be shown for another 2 years. January 2011 arrived, and with it a 6-minute trailer showcasing more than what the world had received in the past. At last, the players' hopes for tangible proof of the game's continued existence would be made evident. A mix of both fully pre-rendered cinematics that bookend gameplay, combat, and in-game cutscenes, we see a deeper look into the characters that make up this world. We open with Noctis being awoken from sleep in the back of his car, passing security to enter the crown city of Insomnia. We cut to Prince Noctis at a formal event, with a painting of Etro, the goddess of death in this universe, shown on display. A glimpse of Stella is seen before she approaches Noctis to ask if he can also see the light that she sees. She goes on to say that when Etro opens the gates to welcome the souls of the fallen, the land of the dead will shine up to heaven. Such light is only visibly seen by a select few who are gifted with powers from the land of the dead. Stella emphasizes that she believes that by seeing this light, there is special meaning. We are then met with King Regis, Noctis' father, who states that he will not give up his throne, but rather will go down as the last king. Exploration and combat are then shown front and center, giving players an idea of what they may expect in the future. After one last cutscene, the title card is once again shown. Little did we know that this would be the last time we would ever see Final Fantasy Versus XIII under its original name. While the games were being actively developed, both teams would run into problems, specifically with the use of Crystal Tools, the company's proprietary game engine. While most game engines are ready to go before production starts, Crystal Tools was no such story. The programming team developing the engine made the decision to have the toolkit meet as many demands from the teams as possible. Hence, the engine would not be finalized before work would start for Final Fantasy XIII. Since the engine was being developed in tandem with the game, many developers found it difficult to use, and without proper documentation, almost impossible. Rather than waiting for the engine to be finished and risk losing time, the team decided that the best course of action would be to start creating assets regardless. However, this would prove to be fruitless. The team soon learned that many assets created would not be compatible with Crystal Tools, and would thus need to be recreated, causing significant delays for what was to be the next generation of Final Fantasy. To prevent further delays, the FF13 team would need additional help. In order to ensure that the game would be completed in time, many members from Nomura's team were asked to help with the project. This led to developers working on Versus pulling double duty, which in turn would contribute to a slower development on their own project. As Nomura said at the time, Versus is waiting on 13. When Final Fantasy XIII finally released globally in 2010, work could resume for Versus 13, but the troubles didn't end there. Due to Crystal Tools' forced tailoring for the now-released Final Fantasy XIII, the build for Versus 13 was no longer compatible and ran into significant issues as the engine could not handle the game's open-world design. This led to the engine being virtually unusable, forcing Nomura's team back to square one. By this time, it had been decided that rather than developing the game for the PlayStation 3, it would be developed for 8th generation hardware instead. With the PlayStation 4 around the corner, Square wanted to avoid releasing the game on outdated hardware, as the release date was still not in sight. Due to this, Square Enix would invest in a new proprietary engine, known as the Luminous engine, to handle this transition of platforms.
What do we have here? No job is too daunting as long as the coin is good.
Bah, you'd sell your own mother if the coin was good.
My father too. Now quiet down and help me decide.
One other game was plagued by Crystal Tools, Final Fantasy XIV. Due to miscommunication amongst the departments and persistent issues with using the engine, the team responsible would create a game with abysmal performance issues. While certain areas of the game would run decently, areas such as city-states would have incredibly low frame rates and frequent crashes. Resource allocation was so unevenly dispersed that something minuscule like a flower pot would have as many polygons as a player character. Almost immediately afterward, Square appointed Dragon Quest team member Naoki Yoshida as the game's new director in order to rebuild the game from the ground up. In order to accomplish such a feat, the company needed all hands on deck. Once again, members working on Versus 13 were asked to help reach this goal, thus delaying development even further. By this point, the project's reputation within the company was one of notoriety. Pressure on the team was rising, and both fans and the company were growing anxious. In order to remedy this, then CEO Yoichi Wada came up with a plan. Final Fantasy Type 0 director Hajime Tabata and his team were to mix with Nomura's team so the project could be finished. At this point, Nomura and Tabata were to be co-directors. Due to the ever-growing budget and seemingly endless development time, talks of rebranding the game were as early as 2007. As the years went on, this suggestion only became stronger. In E3 of 2013, a new trailer was shown. With a new engine and restructured team, the game looked to finally be on its way to being completed. However, the game that would be completed would not be the one that was first shown to the world. The game would be rebranded as Final Fantasy XV, becoming the next mainline game within the series. This changed more than the name, but also the tone and narrative. The Fabula Nova Crystallis mythos would be all but abandoned, and the original plot would be altered to fit a more accessible audience. According to Tabata, the newly assembled team had assessed the game's status. By the time that the platform and name change were decided, Tabata stated that the game was only 20% complete, and that the staff were exhausted and fretful. Tetsuya Nomura would be reassigned to other projects later that year, making Tabata the sole director for the game. Versus 13 was all but discarded, locked away tight to never see the light of day. However, no matter the lock, there is always a key. At E3 of 2013, the same year, one other long-awaited title would be revealed. Kingdom Hearts 3 would finally be entering production, following the setup left by Dream Drop Distance that year prior. Over the course of the 6 years leading up to the game's release, there would be practically nothing left on the table when it came to the unknown. Retrospectively, there would be a lot that was shown front and center that likely would have done better if kept a mystery. Because of this, a new cast of unknown characters to meet simply wasn't expected. When the game released in 2019, a peculiar character made his debut: Yozora. Yozora made his appearance during the opening for the Toy Box world as part of a trailer for a fictional video game known as Verum Rex. It was believed at the time to only be a reference by Nomura to Versus XIII. His design, along with those of his entourage, were echoes of a game long past that was never fully realized. In true Nomura fashion, we would discover that the similar imagery was only the tip of the iceberg. Yozora's name translates from Japanese to night sky, while Noctis's full name, Noctis Lucis Caelum, is Latin for the same thing. Both naming conventions are the opposite of Sora, the main character of Kingdom Hearts, whose name means sky. This falls in line with an interview conducted with Nomura years prior, where he stated that Noctis was to be the quote-unquote opposite of Sora, even down to the name. An interesting detail for sure, but still not substantial enough to be more than a reference. It wouldn't be until the game's secret ending and the Remind DLC that everything would start to click. When Sora and Riku both wake up in different parts of Tokyo, we see a familiar character sitting atop one of the buildings. As Yozora observes the streets below, a familiar tune begins to play before transitioning into the dearly beloved motif. When Sora and Yozora meet for the first time, Yozora tells him,
"No, this isn't the real world, and I am here. But this isn't what I really look like."
This could only be referring to Yozora being Noctis before he was remade to fit someone else's vision. In fact, another character says a similar line earlier in the game. Toward the end of his journey, when within the final world, Sora meets a certain star, a nameless star in fact. When Sora asks who she is, she replies with,
"They took away my name. Everything about me."
This is undoubtedly the latest iteration of Stella, whose name means star, and was taken from her in Final Fantasy XV when she was swapped out in favor of Lunafreya. When battling Yozora, there are two ways in which it'll end. Sora will either lose and enter a state of crystal stasis, a lore element from the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, or should he win, Yozora will fade into the blue sky before the screen fades to black. And then he wakes up.
Impressive, is it not?
We then see a one-to-one recreation of the 2011 Versus XIII trailer, solidifying the notion that this was more than just a mere reference.
Having these weird thoughts lately.
Like, is any of this for real or not? None of this makes sense to me.
Later on in Melody of Memory, we would learn that the place that both Sora and Yozora have gone to is a realm of fiction, of unreality, of fantasy. The nameless star claims that the unreality that Sora has disappeared to is a place known as Quadratum, and it is there that we will continue our journey. While Versus XIII was dismantled, contorted, and reworked to fit the demands of executive pressure, its spirit never disappeared. It stayed within Nomura's heart until he found the appropriate place to once again explore what was taken from him. Nomura has time and time again denied that these parallels are related to Versus 13, avoiding the subject whenever pressed. With the Kingdom Hearts 20th anniversary event around the corner, there was a lot of speculation as to what will be revealed. We don't know much, but what is available to us has led to wild speculation. What we do know is that the building Nomura has chosen to hold his event, Shibuya Hikarie, translates roughly to Toward the Light, and this could be the event in which we see what other parts of Versus 13 have made their way into the present. After all these years, Tetsuya Nomura still has stories to tell of a world of kings, a place of eternal night, a myth based in fantasy, and one way or another, his story will be told.